You know when I'll be fine. She ended up getting in trouble for having some play on that cliff.
what is lunacy? What is insanity? In the 19th century, many tried to answer these questions. Some thought lunatics were people who lacked reason, but were conscious of their surroundings. Others believed lunacy occurred when blood wasn't reaching the brain. There were those who even said that when lunatics were violent, it was just nature's way of releasing excess energy. Perhaps the best definition comes from Dr. William Neville, who wrote that insanity was a generic word applied to functional derangement of the brain under extremely diversified and often even opposite behaviors. Regardless of the definition used, we know that the insane were sent to asylums. In France, a law was introduced in 1838 which allowed for the committal of the insane by their family or by prefects. In New York, in 1866, laws were passed that required that an insane person be sent by their family members to a state lunatic asylum. Asylums were supposed to treat and cure the insane through medical and moral treatments. But what happened behind closed doors? Look at the women committed to these asylums, and you find a different picture. The asylums contain women who had dared to question and disagree with their husbands over Christian ideology. Women whose families thought they had expressed too much grief, or too little. They had all challenged social norms through their actions or mere presence. Not only that, but the asylums frequently abused their patients, beating and whipping them. Investigations found patients living in squalor, naked and chained in their rooms. What were these asylums meant for then? Were asylums supposed to be treating the insane? Or silencing those who challenged the status quo?
Hi all done. Again, I want to apologise for how long it's taken for me to upload any new material. For exactly the same reasons before. It's got so much going on in my life. Anyway, enough of that. So what you just seen was a clip of what used to go on in some of the lunatic asylums or institutions. They've come under so many different names over the years, and it's not something that is supposedly new through history. I mean, obviously the timeline is questionable, and I question a lot of the stuff before the 1800s, like Quantumness, and when you have no records, scarce records, and you're relying on other people's stories, I think it's a very slippery slope. So because of the lack of documentation before the 1800s, you do have to take everything with a pinch of salt. I want to talk today about some of the reasons that they were putting people into these asylums or institutions. But not only that, I want to sort of try and point out, without alarming people too much, of the striking parallels of today. And it does seem to be a way where they seem to silence people and possibly keep stuff out of the mainstream. Therefore, when people are looking back through the records and the history, it does make it difficult for people to find out the truth. But yeah, I'll be looking through largely because this is my area in Dorset, a particular asylum. It does actually tie in quite well with some of the architecture as well, and a little side bit where it's claims that this complex is built in a ridiculously quick amount of time. But essentially, yeah, this video is about the mental institutions. Yeah, was it possibly used in an attempt to change the mindsets of nations? Because it would be, and the evidence does suggest, a way to suppress, and could they, by force, could past known histories and culture have been wiped out. Anyone who questions the status quo would just labelled as lunatic.
These institutions have a history, and most of these old asylums are these Tartarian, old world looking buildings that have been taken over and repurposed. You find very similar themes with the same common story, and they all use similar terminology, such as being founded or established in 1804 or 1820. But what if these were not created during the 1800s, but were actually taken over after some type of reset? Many of the dates that they give us can be easily manipulated as well. But for the most part, the oldest asylum is in Virginia, and it was founded in 1773. So, most of these all started popping up around the 1812 to 1850 Civil War time period, and they actually used that as an excuse for why they needed to create even more of these institutions, because people were insane after the war and they needed these institutions as places of refuge. History attempts to paint these asylums in a positive light, but what if it's the complete opposite?
That was a clip from Mind Unveiled. You should be able to see it in the top left-hand corner. Highly recommend his channel and work. So, Dorset County Asylum started its life at Forston House. It was a private dwelling that was supposedly donated by Francis John Brown. Another interesting story to this as well, which has been a deep rabbit hole that I've gone down. I've been doing this research for nearly a month now. But this Francis John Brown was the last in line in his family. So, because tradition used to be that you used to hand down your assets to your first son. And of course, if you didn't have any children, which I don't believe Francis Brown did, I'm imagining it was decided by the court who got the assets. It's very interesting that Francis John Brown is the last in line in his family, and his property that gets donated for a lunatic asylum. Anyway, I diverge. So yeah, it started off its life as at Forston House, which was a relatively large property, but very quickly, and you can see in some of the reports through the years, that it became overcrowded and they needed another location. A new location was sited at a place in Harrison. So the asylum was designed by Henry Edward Kendall Jr. and it was in an 1859 competition. This seems to be a common theme with quite a lot of asylums across the country. So they bought the site in 1860 and the asylum opened in 1863. So you telling me that they built this place in 3 years? I can pretty much safely say, or we can pretty much safely say that that isn't the case. So who have they bought it from? That is not clear. I've looked. I really have looked. So again, yeah, it fits into what others have said with these places being, it's very careful wording, like established or founded. Were these places just taken over after some sort of reset? Was it tied in with the enclosure acts that were kind of going on, where land was just being, swamps of land were just being taken over by the rich, and what used to be sort of common land was just being taken over as people's backyards, basically. This is a report from 1864 for the year 1863 from a Dorset asylum in Dorchester, Charminster. I believe it's now called Harrison House. But yeah, I wanted to show you a few things from this report. that are quite interesting. Here we've got a document from Dorset Asylum. Skipped it a bit, I want to read to you. So, the only death to which we have specially to advert was that of Sarah Polden, a pauper patient from Wimborne Minster, who was brought from her home in a state of extreme prostration after attack of acute mania, and died of exhaustion within 5 days of her admission. So what they'll say is, well, it wasn't understood back then, and we're only at the beginning of understanding mental health and all this, blah, 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 blah. So basically the definition of mania, I'd never heard of it before, to be honest, but it is a thing, and there's been articles and bits and pieces written on it. So mania can be defined as extremely elevated mood, both physical and emotional. Therefore, we can say that acute mania is sudden and severe onset of an elated mood. The mood can be irritable, aggressive, or so. Basically, a form of bipolar. So if you go back to the document, they're trying to make out that these people were dying of bipolar. This is a report from Forster, I believe, 1860, page 8, I believe. So, one case was received from the Union of Weymouth, which ought to be noticed. The man had been a convict in Dartmoor prison for some length of time, and was discharged on ticket of leave and sent to his parents at Weymouth. His first act was the use of violent language towards them, swearing they were no relations of his and uttering threats of very unpleasant nature. He was immediately conveyed to the Union, and from thence here, he was reported to me as having been insane for several months. And this being so, he must have been discharged from the prison in an insane state. If we look at a register here for 1866, and we've got some of the causes of insanity. So if we go down a list, assigned case of insanity, you've got religious excitement, loss of wages, excessive drinking, and if you look down the form of mental disorder, you'll see the majority of them are mania. Again, this is from the same year, and this is not a discharge form, but where they have written down some of the deaths and the causes in that particular year. So don't get me wrong, like I've mentioned, I'm sure there were some people in these places that generally needed help. But as we know today, I mean, you don't need to send people to madhouses to deal with epilepsy. Yeah, they shouldn't be dying at. I mean, if you look at the fourth line down, he's 29 years old and he's died of epilepsy and exhaustion. So knowing what we know now, are these causes of death genuine? You've got to say you got exhaustion from mania, epilepsy. I'll read you out this article because it's really good for understanding the timeline of things that went on. Yeah, the word Bedlam comes from the Priory of St Mary at Bethlehem, which was founded in London during the 13th century. By 1377, it had become home to people suffering from mental illness, as the inhabitants were described at the time distracted persons. The law, meanwhile, was concerned that landowners were of sound mind, and indeed the law continued to be concerned about the property throughout the centuries. By 1735, Hogarth was using Bedlam to end his social morale fable of the rake's progress, and the conditions in which patients found themselves were horrendous. It would have to be said that the terminology by which mental health was described throughout history gives very little thought to the patients or their families. By the end of the 19th century, more than 70,000 patients had passed through the doors of an insane asylum of some kind or other. Nationally, there were 120 asylums. The 1800 Criminal Lunatic Act was particularly interested in securing those people who wanted to assassinate the monarch and the criminally insane. The 1808 County Asylum Act dealt with fundraising methods that combined taxation with public subscription. The idea was that the poor insane should be removed from workhouses and prisons. The wealthy insane were being paid for by their families and resided in private sanitariums or locked up in various secluded attic rooms. Almost inevitably, lunacy became a condition in many countries as a method of differentiating between the deserving and undeserving poor. I ruined that. So, basically, yeah, lunacy suddenly became a condition in all these countries. I won't say that other word. But there was also the fact that men and women who behaved in a socially unacceptable way could be deemed to be mad and shut away, often for the rest of their lives. Records reveal that many people spent their lives locked up in asylums, having been sent there for reasons other than madness, including in one instance for excessive shopping in her husband's opinion. I'll show you some of the reasons. It's quite amusing for the people back then. In 1828, an act required all pauper lunatics to be documented and certificated. This in turn would mean that commissioners would be able to inspect institutions and people incorrectly placed in asylums would be released, in theory. And care could be monitored. Gradually, more humane treatment became the norm, although restraint remained common practice for a long time, as did incarcerating people not for mental health problems, but for their socially unacceptable behaviour or for having the misfortune to be born with learning difficulties. So I'm just going to squeeze this in the middle quickly, as it's kind of the main reason that I'm kind of doing this video and why it's kind of connected to the old world history. So what a lot of us suspect is that the Napoleonic Wars have a big connection with some sort of reset, and it's no secret in mainstream that there was a war then. It was obviously originally called the Great War, I believe. So people back then. Now, imagine for a minute that what we suspect is quite possibly true, that they basically destroyed, pretty much conquered the world. Lots of places were taken over, probably left abandoned. They probably had lots of mansions and that left over. Lots of lands, didn't know what to do with it. And you're going to have lots of people that know what's happening. What are you going to do with these people? You're going to put them in mental institute, or you're going to have to try and orchestrate a way to get rid of these people. And how would you do that? And what a lot of us suspect is it was done through these mental institutions, and that is why they were popping up all over the world. We'll take into consideration the lack of documentation before the 1800s. Was it destroyed? And like what's going on at the moment, it's not just going to be an overnight process. It's going to be a slow process. Like what's going on at the moment, we understand it a little bit better with how they're sort of trying to start the reset at the moment. People like us back then would have been suppressed. The info that they were producing would have been suppressed, just like the info that we share at the moment is suppressed and taken down, deleted. Back then, it would just that had been destroyed, the book burnings, all that sort of stuff. In 1845, county asylums became a legal obligation, and lunacy commissioners were appointed to oversee the running of asylums. It was only in 1890, with the passage of another act, that county asylums began to move away from their pauper associations to begin their evolution to hospitals caring for all walks of life. So yeah, in 1845, it became a legal obligation for every county to have an asylum. Interestingly, Wakefield was one of the first asylums to employ therapeutic employment, though this was thanks to the enlightened attitude of Dr. William Ellis, who moved from Wakefield to Hanwell in 1832. Ellis was a believer in the benefits of outdoor work rather than the brutality espoused by earlier mad doctors. It is perhaps for this reason that many of the Victorian asylums were set in beautiful grounds. In practice, it would appear that one doctor and a vicar would be enough to certify a poor person in some locations. And going back to looking at comparisons with today, I just wanted to highlight a few things and a couple of my worries, and I don't want it to sort of come across as fear-mongering or alarmism, and I'm kind of glad I'm doing this video now when the C bill in Parliament has now elapsed, because there are certain things in that bill that back up would suggest maybe they even did do it to a few people. You don't know. You wouldn't hear about these things. Yeah, they may have detained people under that legislation bill. I think you know what I'm talking about. So what have they been promoting the last few years? And we know full well that they do not care about our health or about our well-being. So the last 3, 4, 5 years, they have been hammering the hell out of mental health and saying to be aware of this and aware of that. And it's very similar with the parallels of how they sold locking people up in institutions to the masses before. Again, bear in mind that none of this stuff is going to be done overnight. They can't just create these ideas, create these agendas, and then expect the public just to come on board overnight. They have to build it up, sow seeds, propaganda, all that stuff. The reason I've always been a little bit worried about this, and it's always been in the back of my mind, is because we know what this agenda is at the moment.
Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3.
But we know this is a depopulation agenda, right? And the thing that's always been in the back of my mind is, whilst they're doing all this stuff, and the V's are taking out certain people, the only people that are being taken out at the moment are what I would class as, without being too disrespectful to those people, they're taken out, it's the brainwash, isn't it? So our numbers, our percentage compared to the asleep, compared to the masses, is turning in our favour. And it will always turn in our favour, because it's only the heavily conditioned masses that will go along with these things and be victims. So I've always thought in the back of my mind, what do they have planned for us? There must be something they must have a plan to deal with this percentage swaying into our favour, because whilst they're doing this, it's always making our percentage better and bigger. And like I've mentioned, they don't do these things overnight. And if you know of a little thing called Agenda 2021, Agenda 21 it was before, Agenda 30 now. Is this the plan they have for us again? As they say, history repeats itself. I don't really like those catchphrase, cliche sayings, but there is no truth to it. It goes around in cycles. They use all the same tricks again, over and over again, with slight alterations, obviously. But yeah, that's always been my worry, and I say it just noticing the parallels with what they were doing before. Are they building up to this again?
And I'm just going to leave you with another clip from Mind Unveiled, which is really interesting. I'll put the video in its entirety. It's from the same video that I showed a clip of earlier, but I'll put a link for that in the description. But are they the fascinations and delusions of the schizophrenic, or could these things possibly have existed? What do you think?
There was this guy named James Tilly Matthews. He was a London tea broker who is basically the first documented case of schizophrenia. In the 1790s, concerned at the likelihood of a war between Britain and France, Matthews, who traveled to France, was a part of some type of resistance, or the Girondists, which were attempting to end the monarchy. Whether he was working as a spy for the English is questionable, but after spending time in France, he was accused of being associated with these Girondists, which the French establishment at the time used the whole reign on terror as an excuse to imprison their enemies and to continue their agenda of control. So Matthews was thrown in prison, and after 3 years, the French authorities concluded that he was a lunatic and released him. When he returned to London, Matthews wrote 2 letters to Lord Liverpool, complaining about conspiracies directed to him, and during some debate in the House of Commons, he yelled treason. Now, I don't know if that's completely true, who knows, but basically the officials arrested him and placed him in the Bethlehem Hospital in 1797. After examination, he declared that he had taken part in secret affairs of state in reference to his efforts in France. After 10 years in the hospital, his friends and family petitioned for his release on the grounds that he wasn't insane. His family hired their own doctors, Matthews was re-examined, and he was declared sane. But this is when it gets really crazy. A year after he was released, a man named John Haslam produced the book Illustrations of Madness, in which he intended to settle the dispute over Matthews' sanity. Essentially, this book is what ends the debate on what really happened with Matthews. It shares his story and paints him as a lunatic, even though the author does attempt to stay unbiased. But here's the thing, even though there are some elements to the story that may be caused by some type of schizophrenia, it's likely that this was purposely induced, as he knew way too much information. What do you think they did to him for 10 years in the hospital? So essentially, this was made to make this information look like complete insanity, when really, there may be some truth to it. Let's remember that during this time, asylums were mainly vehicles of the state. So Matthews believed that there was this gang of criminals and spies skilled in pneumatic chemistry. This gang would torment him by means of rays emitted by a machine called the heirloom, or gaseous charge generator. They put James Matthews in Bethlehem Hospital because he knew of this secret war machine that was used by these French revolutionaries, which we can ask, who were these revolutionaries, and is there something else going on with that story? But essentially, 250 years before the CIA's failed brainwashing experiments, somehow French revolutionaries in France had created a mind control machine and death ray. Is this another setup revolution similar to the Bolshevik Revolution that was...
Check, check. Picking me up on the other microphone. Anyway, this book's called Madman's Library. In it, I saw that heirloom. Where is that at? There was a drawing of it. I think it was in this one. What? That's really strange. Madman. Okay, I'm not mad. So, let me find this here. Dang it. Oh, that's pretty good. Well, there was the heirloom thing. You're not going to put the heirloom in here, really? Oh, it's right around here. Ah, this is a mind control device. I can't see it very well. This isn't terrible, but you can't see what it says. It says giant mind control device known as the heirloom, as imagined by James Tilly Matthews. Um, okay, does the Matthews delusion centered around the insidious device he called the heirloom? Convinced that a villainous gang adept at pneumatic chemistry, studying gases and chemical reactions, set up a machine, the kind of gas discharge generator, close to Bethlehem, and were torturing him daily by zapping him with harmful rays. So, I don't know. Not crazy. Not at all.
A counter operation? James somehow found himself mixed in the middle, and only due to his family, he luckily got out and left us with the only known knowledge of these devices. Who knows, these could be even older and explain how many other cities were taken over behind the scenes. But in his very descriptive explanation of the machine, Matthews explained that these machines had been deployed all over London, secretly, in cellars. The heirloom was enormous. It stood 7 meters tall, and it was surrounded by barrels that fed noxious gases through oiled leathered pipes into the main body of the machine. The gases were derived from substances including gas from the horse's anus, seminal fluid, and putrid human breath. The heirloom used magnetically charged air particles that could be directed towards its victim in order to induce the effect of mesmerism. Of course, we don't take mesmerism seriously today in modern science. However, this was not the case during this time period, and obviously there was an advanced machine capable of inducing these effects, so who's to say that these people can't do the same with their minds? But regardless, the machine needed to be operated by a certain amount of members who each had their own name and duty, as described by Matthews. The main body of the machine had a number of keys, levers, and brass retorts. These were used to modulate the flow of magnetically charged air that was emitted from the machine. Skillfully combined sequences of the various levers and keys could produce different types of air current, which could be directed towards the victim to assault them with a whole arsenal of psychological and physiological effects. Essentially, this was some type of instrument, and an art at that, as someone would basically play it as a piano and magnetically charge the air current with the intention of directing it towards the victim to assault them. One of these effects were called kiting, where an idea is forced into the thoughts of the victim, which undulates in the intellect for hours together, and how much soever the person assailed may wish to direct his mind to other subjects, he finds himself unable to do so. Similarly, thought-making. This gang could literally suck the thoughts out of a victim out of their head and replace it with any subject they choose. They had an effect called lobster cracking, in which the external pressure of the magnetic atmosphere surrounding the person assailed was increased so as to stagnate his circulation and produce instant death. They also interestingly talk about nutmeg, which is also known to give a psychedelic reaction to those who are allergic. They must have known that it could be used as a suggestogen. There are even depictions of the number of controls this machine had, multiple parameters for a variety of different settings. Now think about it, if this was just a delusion, then how is it possible to have such a detailed description of this device? There is another part of this that we will cover briefly. Basically, when you look up influencing machine, what you have is all these educated mainstream scholars concluding that the heirloom and other mind control devices are just visions of schizophrenics. But not just that, but there's even something more profound to get from all this, that the influencing machine is some deep subconscious archetypal trope. Now, I'm not saying that this can't happen to someone with schizophrenia, but I am very suspicious of this public opinion and that these are all simply hallucinations of madmen. First off, isn't it convenient that the first schizophrenia patient ever just so happens to have the most detailed engravings of this machine, and no one at this time had been discussing any technologies like this in public literature, so there was no way he just imagined this out of nowhere. They literally built a working replica of the machine. It wasn't just a delusion, this was influenced by some type of event, and this wasn't just with James Matthews. There have been several accounts of artists depicting these types of devices, but they're just labeled as insane. Or they just try to decode this as some deep Jungian philosophical symbolism when, really, there may be multiple things going on. Spiritual forces that influence these peoples, and/or physical devices that actually do exist and influence the thoughts of their victims. There are actually quite a few depictions of these, and of course, it's not to say that every one of these is real, but this idea of a mind control device is obviously prevalent in our psyches, and sure, you can take the psychiatrist approach and just say it's an aspect of our deep subconscious or whatever, and I'm sure that does play a part, but it's not the meat of the subject. All the scholarly work on the subject tends to take this viewpoint. However, as many of you are thinking, these types of devices have existed for who knows how long.
Try this weird 15-second bedtime technique to get it up whenever you want. Most men continue to take blue pills just to get it up, because they've been brainwashed by the mainstream media that it
What the fuck?
What if you could do SEO smart?
This video is going to explore the world and realm universe of the 1800s and the mid 1800s by exploring this encyclopedia from the 1850s that I found from Germany, which is just mind-blowing. But this picture in particular is from San Francisco, and John Levy always refers to it as, you know, really having no purpose. It's just a structure. You can't really do anything. There's no inside to it. And also in a recent video by John Levy, he showed these videos, or these images, which are early photographs of, I believe, Scotland in the 1850s. And this stuff is mind-blowing just because of all the buildings and the way it's kind of an interestingly old photo. But you can see obelisks, which I would have never expected, and just all these spires going off into the distance, and so many different architectural structures that are reminiscent of what we consider Roman, or what we see at the White House, and all throughout America, all throughout the world. Just proof that this somehow there was a uniform civilization that followed the same rules of architecture and really built things all over the place. You know, maybe an ancient construction company at some point that just built these massive things, and just definitely there's no telling really what they are and how old a lot of these are, how many of them have been destroyed and have gone through changes. But it's very interesting in the 1850s, because just then you don't think of it as being that far back, but all these things existed. All these people were living in these different buildings. And so I came across this encyclopedia, and it just kind of blew my mind as to what would be found in an iconographic encyclopedia of science, literature, and art in 1850s Germany. But it just proves, and I think Germany has a big piece to the puzzle, their history and Tartarian, Aryan kind of connection, and the fact that the world just almost just needed to eradicate them for some reason and do so much damage to their country is just suspicious to me. And so this this ancient cultures section, this is the architecture section of the encyclopedia, and I'm just going to show you these pictures because not only are they absolutely some of the greatest art I've ever really seen, I think they're all engravings of immense detail, but they're so filled. Every page is just packed with so many different things that are really beautiful to look at and really important to learning how things work. Just like an encyclopedia you'd think from nowadays and the way they used to be in the 80s, 90s, just very informative, very descriptive, and this is all visually, so it's even more stunning in that sense. And a lot is revealed through this. So this architecture section shows a lot of ancient structures, different underground things with huge columns, just absolutely massive things. And compare this to the way they build nowadays, and we're supposed to be so advanced and all this stuff, but we cannot build these things. Like, we really, no one has built things with massive columns like this in a long time. And in the 1850s, it seemed to be a lot of these buildings were either being built or they were being renamed and redated to pretend that they were being built during this time. And I'm really torn between this, whether they were built in ancient times and then relabeled and rehistorized, or if they were actually capable of building these in 1850s. And a lot of them, they really ever show a construction photo, if ever, and the similarities are just too much to just too much to believe. And you know, we claim like a lot of these things, like the Acropolis and different things, are from like thousands of years ago, over 1,000 years ago. And then we see them very similar buildings of the same exact perfection, same level of magnitude, same style, same materials, and they're found in America in the 1800s and early 1900s supposedly, and all over the world at different time periods, depending on how they've been able to scrap the history and make people forget. And if you think about it, in the 1850s, you know, reading some adult my age in the 1850s seeing this encyclopedia would be a lot different than us seeing it right now. Like, us seeing it in this perspective from this time period, it's kind of like, wow, like we're really like, oh my god, what a blast through the past. Like, looking at this, like, I can't tell if it's ancient or if it's you know, from the 1850s, like designed during that recent time or the early 1800s. But seeing it from back then, they must have had so much better of a knowledge. Different stories had been passed on to them about what these were, what the shapes of those triangular blocks were, what, if any purpose, electrical or etherical, that these pagodas had, or these structures, what was inside them, what was their purpose. Like, a lot of that stuff, that history has been just like re-ramped, rewritten, scrubbed, just reanalyzed, falsely propagated, through it, falsely scholarized over the since the 1850s. So it's really tough to kind of see and wonder what someone in the 1850s would have thought of looking at all these things. They'd be like, oh, that church is 800 years old. Like, oh, like and have that history be preserved through that 800 years. At some point in the 1800s, this history got scrubbed, and the reality of it got scrubbed and got erased from us, and we don't appreciate it. People of our generation absolutely do not appreciate this type of ancient stuff as much as a child would have probably in that time. And these things are absolute wonders like this. Like, how can we look at this and be like, how do you build that? We look at that now in our technologically advanced time, and we're still like, what? How is that possible? And back then, I wonder what they would have thought, like if they had known, if it was inherent that they were capable of building these things, or they saw them in the 1800s being built, or if they were just existing for hundreds of years before that, and they were an anomaly to these people. Maybe some of the stories had preserved, maybe some of the books at that time had still existed that dove into the architects of this and the builders and how much effort it took, and maybe one of those builders may have written a book at one point that like explained his process of creating this, or it's something else, or it's built by another civilization of things, and they try to say aliens built a lot of these things like the pyramids and all this nonsense, but it's just like, no, like, we're capable of it. I think the answer lies in the art, it lies in the structures, and a lot of these structures have amazingly elaborate carvings in them, and I feel that all of those need to be re-examined for the symbolism, common symbolism throughout, and different scenes that they depict. Some of the scenes could have been changed over time, but a lot of them I think are too impossible and too perfect to have changed. So maybe they could have just changed the story, but the characters are still there, and I believe it's still possible to deduce some truth from the remaining artwork that lies around. But although we do need to raid the Smithsonian. But look at all these tops, the capitals of every single state house in America before the dates they were supposed to be built. And this is like just what they look like, the same exact thing that you're finding in this German book from the 1850s. And there's no words in this, so there's no way of telling where these buildings were from. You can recognize some, but again, they're all built and the people are so small in comparison to them. Like, they take up these tiny little things. Meanwhile, the doorways are like made for people 5 times bigger. The archways are just massive. The rooms are made to can fit a lot of people. The etherical free energy structures on the top, there's always some kind of metal kind of thing. It seems like they're all conductors, like these different pinnacles, these different towers that were incredible amounts of effort to erect and to build and to cut. A lot of the obelisks are said to be cut from one stone. So that's so much effort for just a stone. And either we're missing something big time, or they were definitely they had some type of power, some type of purpose, some type of use. And this is all, again, all the Capitol buildings and different things that you see all over America in the 1850s as they're trying to take them down. Cities are just have been on a mission to destroy these buildings. We've seen Notre Dame burn down. That's going to radically change in the future. And people will gradually forget what it used to look like, maybe, unless we can preserve it. But these different structures were all awesome. They house different things. You can see the floor plans, all these different bridges from this time. They were capable of building these amazingly strong bridges. And that's the thing. Every single one of those buildings and bridges was so strong. And it could withstand any type of natural disaster. And now we get the technology section, which is really awesome. And I'll just deal with architecture and technology today, but you can see different things like tunnels. They had the ability to carve into massive tunnels for what? How many years? Thousands, probably. How many years old are these things? If nowadays there's a lot of things that are just new to us. And the steam engine, how old is that? All these things we can say, oh, they can slap a date on them, this was built in the 1820s by blah, blah, blah. But that could all be a lie. The trains could be very old. This technology could be so old. A lot of the old cities, they have tracks laid down in them that always seem very old, like in San Francisco. The tracks in that old 1900s video before the fire seem like they've been there for a very long time. And that's why it was probably so easy to make tracks across this whole country. Like high tension wires, I've always thought, are on interesting paths because they're probably carved out. Rivers. How long have those rivers been there? Thousands of years, through civilizations, through all this stuff. Dams, different waterways, different pipes, different dikes, different levees, causeways. There's so many different things here that in the 1850s seemed like nothing. In a lot of the things, they use either steam or different kinds of mechanical power in order to get their strength. I believe it shows mining drills in some of these, some different pressure pipes, different tubings, different parts of the motors. Steam, I believe, is being used here. Coal fire, powered things. Different, look at the patterns you can see, the golden ratio pattern all over the place. Everything mathematically precise, fitting in lockstep. Just everything is a mechanism, like a clock, using the forces of nature to do the work for it, do the power. Do all the different things. It doesn't have electricity through it. These aren't machines that are going to break down in about a week like pretty much every product you get nowadays. They're not made from garbage plastic, toxic nonsense plastics that are just cheap, break, melt, smell, pollute, do all this stuff. These were physical machines that were strong, they were durable, and they would probably last an incredibly long time. And if they broke, they'd be easy to fix. It wouldn't be like a computer or something where once it breaks, it's done. The printing press, they were printing coins. They've been printing coins for thousands of years. So that means if they can print coins, I think they've been able to print books for thousands of years as well. And a lot of other things. You could make so many different things with that. Jewelry of all different kinds, different products, different things. Camera obscura is a natural phenomenon. I'm guaranteeing that they knew that a long time ago. All these different shafts, these mining things. So they've been digging into the past for a very long time. How many times have they come across things and then just like kind of had them be lost in time? Come across underground cities, catacombs, ruins, treasures, mine shafts, ancient crystals, jewels, and just kind of then a hole gets covered in a storm. It's gone for 10 years. Nobody knows about it ever again. It's filled in. Nature covers it. It does that so many times. Nature is an easy way to help the forces that be rewrite history because it just swipes over everything. And just again, so much different tech, farming tech, different everything from tools to different processes of filtering different things. I like this how they even use the animals as technology because that's considered technology to them. They use them as a very important phase in their livestock, their agriculture, their growth, their construction, their everything. And that in combination with naturally working machines that don't seem to pollute. If anything, steam and water would produce. Like none of these are oil-based. None of these are toxic technologies. They're just all figuring out natural ways of doing things, which I personally like a lot better. It seems like nowadays we put so much trust in these technologies and different things that we're losing our skills and our abilities. And maybe communication is even one of those things. Maybe we used to be able to telepathically communicate or communicate in so many other ways more efficiently and more at a level of more just elaborate and descriptive and just more vivid and beautiful. Who knows? But here's some Piranesi I just wanted to add at the end because he was a very important aspect in trying to preserve these lost artworks of these masters and to really put into question where did these come from, who built these. Like they seem to be impossibly to be built by human hands, some of them, because they are so massive, and a lot of times you'll see these massive buildings at the top of a giant hill or a mountain or something, and during the time of like animals carrying stones, and these are tons of stones and things that weigh many tons, and look at how small the humans are in comparison to it. It seems very much like these were designed by other people for bigger people and at a different time of something that we know nothing about. And I hope we figure it out. Either way, it is a true inspiration just thinking about all this stuff, seeing these artworks and these encyclopedias, and I'm going to show more chapters from this book in the next couple of videos, but they are just inspiring on all levels, so I really want to share them. It's a great reference for any artist out there, anyone that just kind of wants to think and dive into different categories and really look at what an old encyclopedia was like from 1850s Germany. And Germany is an amazing place. I'm going to go into that too in some detail in further videos because there's a lot of mystery there. But there's a lot of mystery everywhere underneath all of us. I hope we discover it. Bless you all. Keep imagining.
Up to 50,000 cars added daily on Cars.com. Where to next?
An ancient stone tablet is discovered, and decoding its secrets could rock a core belief of Christianity. It seems to tell the story of a Messiah who is killed and rises from the dead after 3 days. Sound familiar? But this Messiah may not be Jesus. This is one of the secrets of Christianity being unearthed by investigative journalist Simka Yakubovich. From deserts to tombs, from Rome to the Holy Land, Simka tracks down the truth behind historical myths, long-held beliefs, and some of
Running a small business takes grit and determination, and a fast, reliable communication solution from Spectrum Business.
Greetings and thank you for joining me on another old world exploration. Before we get started, I want to show you a recent release from Jared Boosters. Now that channel just recently released an old world Cleveland video as well. It gets into some of the prehistory and some of the explanations down through time. Always tells really interesting stories and provides very high quality visuals. So if you're not familiar with this channel, certainly check it out, give them a sub, follow along. So today, zoning in on Cleveland, a very familiar area for us in the videos you've seen from this channel. We've done Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, areas like that. I don't know if I did one on Chicago, but a lot going on in Chicago. Buffalo, of course, all in this area, the Great Lakes. So Cleveland, obviously right in that same category, having a lot of architecture that doesn't fit the historical narrative. And we'll be bringing some of those visuals in this video today. And the first shot we're going with here, the town square. Of course, you have this very old world looking monument in the center. You also have this very large building in the horse and buggy era with stairs going down to the doors. And a nice high quality photograph to begin. And of course you hit the streetcar narrative full on in effect in Cleveland. Nothing new there. And these very tall buildings, right? Turn of the century tall buildings. They don't fit the historical narrative as we're given it. So that's one I always like to feature those. Whether or not they look kind of plain or they have a bit of what we call antiquitech. It's just more of the same. Here you have a school and it's ornately decked out, you know, with all this statue work or molding, whatever you want to call it.
When the hands that do the fixing need fixing, That's a job for O'Keefe's working hands.
Not how you would have done it. You bundle things right, and that saves you up to 10% on your USAA home and auto insurance. Get a quote today.
And then you definitely have that the castle-like feel with Cleveland. A lot of arches, a lot of rounded corners, and very old-looking stone or veneer, whatever you want to call it. Here's a quick shot of the armory. You'll see this again a little bit later on, but looking very old here. And then let's look at the historical narrative for the city. And certainly not a deep, long history here. You have they've sort of sectioned it off on Wikipedia here. The beginning, so right after the American Revolutionary War, I guess it was General Moses Cleveland here, the city named after. Right after. So we have a historical point in time kicking off settlement in this area. And then you have the amalgamating of townships nearby in this time period here. Civil War is the big hinge point of American history for sure. You always get the industrial growth, the big boom happening in this period. And this is usually the period of time that most of the buildings you'll see are attributed to having gone up. And as you'll see, you will see pictures from a lot from 1897 in this video, and you'll see that those buildings look a lot older than something that would have gone up in this time period. And let's have a look at the population. An interesting population curve, actually nothing new, seen this in a lot of cities at this time as well. Current population just under 400,000, but you have here around 1930 a peak. 1950 to 1930, almost 1 million people. You go back to 1900 in that time period where, say between post-Civil War, so here to here, and the city jumps in size in a ridiculous leaps and bounds, close to what it is modern day. So you have this bell curve and this decline in population again. We're living in a time with supposed exponential population growth, but you have so many of these cities in the States with this curve having peaked quite some time ago. And of course you get these a numerous amount of schools with all sorts of tech, I guess you can call it. Some people call it tech or architectural design, but it's really a silly explanation. And a lot of people say, okay, these buildings went up in this fashion and look very European because all these settlers that came over were European, and again, that the timeline doesn't fit. These buildings feeling old, very old. And of course you have the streets from the time too. So this is probably the first decade, 1900s. Very, very well established curb work on the streets. And then you have this layer of mud, and underneath the layer of mud, and you can see it clearly in this picture, you have the rail lines, and have very, very well worn brick roads or cobble roads, whatever you want to call that. There's a good shot as well of the old curb and probably what looks like a topping of some sort. You can see that concrete poured topping on top of an old world curb. So it's a covering up effect going on here. Nothing new, seen this before. Having a very rich history too, Cleveland. You get the Standard Oil Company starting out there with the famous name, building the riches, so on and so forth. Here you have the basement as well. Basement area, horse and buggy, the need to dig, requirements to dig to get all this built. And many of these cities too having a lot going on underground. So just not fitting the historical narrative as I see it. Another color shot of the armory. Many of these old buildings leaving us with a date. You can see 1887 there, leaving no doubt as to when these were built. I don't know. And there it is again. Feeling very much like something I have seen in places like Poland, Czech Republic, Germany. Right, this type of work. You have the polished granite columns here. Of course, no shortage of churches in Cleveland. The temple here, looking very big next to the hospital. Couldn't really find anything else on this. And that's another thing that's I find fishy about the historical narrative is there's a lot that existed that it's very difficult to find any sort of evidence on or much of a story about. So I think we're, as many have said, we're a species with amnesia, and we're looking at a hijacking by, I don't know, for lack of a better word, parasitic entities, and then a repopulation of what once existed here. I know that's difficult for a lot of people to hear. I know, right? You have to really reprogram your brain. It takes a lot of deprogramming to accept a lot of this stuff, which so many of us are unwilling to do. So, but that's just how I see it. I think that's what's going on. I think the evidence is mounting. And I also think there's evidence of some sort of cataclysmic event or events that have occurred on this in this realm, let's say. And we see evidence of it once we gain the eyes to see. It's impossible to unsee it. Here's an armory, central armory, being taken down again. How old does that look? When is that supposed to have been built? No, there it is before the demolition. So, high schools. Who builds high schools in this manner? How many high schools do you know have this many floors? Are we to believe that at this period of time, we're talking about the 1800s, it was just something that was easily done? We don't even do it today. Right? Are we to believe that this was something that would just be easily done for the purposes of teaching children? It's you really have to stretch. You really have to stretch your understanding of all of this. This citizen building, you can hardly see it there. This is another really. I like this one, high res. You get a good sense of the street here. Very interesting how the brickwork goes here from the grate here in the street. So we're dealing with infrastructure that's been there a while. It looks like this has all been sort of cleaned up as well. Very early automobiles, and then massive columns. What we call Romanesque, I suppose. Cornice in the front here, and all sorts of details like this, just over the top details. I get the argument too, well, these people had nothing to do but work all day. They still didn't have the means that we have at our disposal to build this stuff. And I don't know if that's entirely true as well. If that's what all they were doing was working all day, I would suspect life was less hectic. And I think we live in a world now where people working 2-3 jobs and trying to feed a family or just get by. I think we're at desperation right now. As far as that goes, we're looking at evidence of a civilization that could not have existed in that manner. So you're really lending credence to the theory when you say, "Oh, modern day we don't build like that because of time and money." You're lending credence to the possibility or the likelihood of there being a previous civilization that was in a much higher level of comfort and existence. So, like I say, the historical narrative is not allowing for that. If your argument is also that these people had to work day and night to build these buildings, then it doesn't line up, I should say. So all these with the writing here, they're from 1897. So all these buildings firmly standing in 1897. And remember, you saw on the Wikipedia there, only really a 30-year window of industrial development. There was a canal also built from Cleveland, no longer in existence, or being used, I should say, like many of the canals. That's a really strange narrative as well, the canals. And this photograph showing us these poles that we've seen before, and many have said, yeah, telegraph poles, and maybe there was another purpose. Maybe they were inherited from a previous setup. I'm leaving it open.
I'll be back later.
You can nail it down, hammer it down, but I'm gonna